Chris, I'm so glad I finally ran into you after so much time. I'm desperate to have a. Oh my gosh, I have nothing to drink. Oh, I have like two gulps of water in front of me.
It's
Hi.
okay. Say yes. It's been a while, and a lot's happened in the world since we last talked. So I've got a feeling there's a lot to say. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we could have gone in so many directions today. Um, but as promised, I am going to continue something that I started a couple of episodes ago. Because I've been listening to some podcast episodes and reading a book. And before we did the previous episode, I had done an overview of a podcast called The Fascism Barometer and all the ways that the different guests on that show were defining fascism. So lately, I've been listening to some episodes from the podcast Conspirituality. And one of the hosts, Matthew Remski, he's been reading around fascism and anti fascism. And I've also been reading the 2024 book by Peter Gelderloos, They Will Beat the Memory Out of Us, subtitled Forcing Nonviolence on Forgetful Movements. So there's a lot that I'm getting out of this, both the book and the podcast episodes. But the first thing that jumped out for me is the question, and they didn't ask this question, but it made me ask the question, does violence work? And I don't want us to take this question into a particular place as a response to fascism, not today. But instead, I just want us to raise questions around that. So after I give my thoughts, I would love to hear from you, Chris, on your response to this, keeping within kind of the framing that I'm putting it. So that said, there are many different kinds of violence, but I'm going to focus on particular types of examples. And the biggest one that's coming to mind right now is the genocide of the Palestinian people who are starving every day due to aid blockades, which have been imposed by Israel as part of their violence against the Palestinian people. It is a genocide, and genocide is violent. Genocide is a form of violence. So we could ask, is this genocide working? What do we mean by working? Working for whom? What was the goal? If Israel's goal was to have fewer Palestinians living near them, then, well, yes, this violence is working. There are fewer Palestinians living, full stop, period. Bombing and restricting humanitarian aid causes fewer people to live. So we can imagine is if Israel wants to stop having Palestinians on their border, um, having them live near them, then it's working. And we've probably all seen the AI memes of Palestinian land becoming built up as tourist areas with Trump hotels. And if that was the goal, is the violence working? Well, it isn't being built up yet, but it's clearing the way for that to happen, right? Um, what about the violence of abducting people off the streets in the United States and deporting people? The violence of the border. If the goal was to have fewer migrants in the United States, well, it seems like the violence is working because I've heard that there have been like zero irregular migrant crossings in the United States since all this started. And there are people being deported, which leads to fewer migrants in the United States. And what about the violence of police killings? What's the goal there? Fewer people of color, particularly Black people? Is the violence working? Are there fewer people because of police killings? Yes. So we have looked at the violence of genocide, the violence of borders, the violence of the police. It could be argued that that violence is working. Now let's talk about other ways that people die in the United States, for example. Healthcare, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to the medical treatments that people need, life-saving treatments, that leads to death. Now, would we say that the system is violent for not providing people with what is considered to be a human right? And just a little asterisk here around the phrase human right, and invite people to check out the episode we did a little bit ago around the rights discourse and whether that's even useful. So I would rather say that the system isn't providing people with what they need. So, what is the goal by not doing that? To have fewer people living in the United States, to have death through medical neglect? If that's the goal, then the violence seems to be working. And I'll touch on a different goal that could be at play here. But other basic human needs include food and shelter. Is it violent to not allow people access to necessary food? Well, what's happening in Palestine, people are starving. To me, that is violence. It happens in a slightly different way in the United States. But if we're saying that the only way to have food that people need is to have access to the possession of green pieces of paper or electronic accounts that contain ones and zeros in the correct order, is that violence that we're ensuring that fewer people have what they need, and yet the wealth is being like hoarded by very few people, and the other people are suffering. And so people who have close to nothing are desperate to work, willing to work for nothing. Maybe that's the goal of like wealthy people. They want to have more wealth. And in order to do that, they need to be violent towards people so that they are desperate to work for very little or nothing. So the violence in that sense seems to be working. Is it violent to not allow people to take shelter wherever they can, especially when it's not a space where someone isn't already there taking shelter? We know that cities make sweeps of areas where unhoused folks are living in tents. They lose their possessions, their sense of community. Is that violent? I mean, it's referred to as violent, the way that they do those sweeps. Is it working? Is the goal to have fewer people in eyesight of middle and upper classes? Fewer unhoused people in eyesight. So is that working? Yes, that seems to be working. The violence seems to be working. So if we look at it in terms of violence on the order of war, genocide, systems that are being put in place by states, protected by states, what do you think? Do you think that violence is working in these examples? Can you think of similar examples like that?
Well, in listening to you, maybe it's my engineer brain at play, but one of the first things that came to my mind is the basic question, what is violence? And in a way, you've talked about different definitions of violence through the examples that you've given. I'm reminded of people who come into the comment sections of my videos, because I have a video channel on YouTube and TikTok. And just for the purposes of this discussion, I'll call them dictionary bros. They come into my comment section and they say, well, it's not a constitutional crisis in America because the dictionary says X, Y, and Z. It's not fascism because the dictionary says X, Y, and Z. It's not violence. It's not genocide, etc., because the dictionary says X, Y, and Z. So as I was listening to you, I said to myself, let me be a dictionary bro, just for the moment, and see if a dictionary entry actually brings us clarity, or instead actually opens up the conversation more broadly than we were expecting, or at least more broadly than I was expecting. So here, I have Merriam-Webster's dictionary on the Merriam-Webster website. It has the definition of violence, which is, of course, a noun. And here it has 4 records. I'll try to be brief about this because I don't want to hang on every single word. The first record says the use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy. And then there's a sub-record which says an instance of violent treatment or procedure. I think the word violence, particularly in some of your examples, might align very much with this idea of the use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy. But the second record says injury by or as if by distortion, infringement, or profanation, outrage. The third says intense, turbulent, or furious, and often destructive action or force, as in the violence of the storm, and so on and so forth. Now the fourth record says undue alteration, as of wording or sense in editing a text. That was a little bit of an unexpected sub-record that I found a little bit curious, maybe a bit humorous, and yet also aligns with some of the examples that you've given. Now, of course, in language, we can take any word and find that the definition of that word uses other words that we could also seek the definitions of. And so there's a chain of unwinding that we could do if we were serious about really analyzing definitions. But what I'm seeing is even in this one case of using this one dictionary, there's really different worlds that are painted by these definitions. And what I've found in reading the comments of, shall we say, dictionary bros under my videos is that it appears, and obviously I'm generalizing across a base of strangers, people I don't know, it appears that in distracting or trying to define words in a certain way, the function in the conversation is to surface and use a definition that supports their own point. In other words, definitions act as narrative frames for having certain conversations. And I would say, as perhaps you might say, is that narrative making is inherently a political act, meaning the framing of a narrative is subject to social power dynamics. Here's another example. I saw in one of my chat groups just this morning that the founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, was on a podcast episode where he said, no, it's not a genocide in Palestine. It's, really bad and it's, people are starving and such, but no, it's not a genocide. Now, when I look at that in the context of narrative framing, that is to say, we establish a narrative in order to control the outcomes of a certain conversation. We establish a narrative in order to control what is acceptable to talk about or not talk about in this type of conversation. And I will say I didn't listen to the podcast where he said this, so I don't know his full conversation. But what I've observed, again, just generalizing, is the people who are still saying, no, it's not a genocide in Palestine, their narrative framing is, no, it's not a genocide, so there's nothing to be outraged about. There's no reason to stop it. Or if you dig down to the surface, there may be some people who go, quote, mask off and say, yeah, it's a genocide, but they deserve it. Or they asked for it. So when I bring this conversation back to violence, I see that there are these same power dynamics at play around the use of the word violence. And when we use that word, what are we trying to describe? What are we trying to surface? What's the conversation goals that we are looking for? And violence in the context of state power, I think, is a particular example of this. It's the kind of thing where the first thing that surfaced in my mind, and indeed the first entry on the dictionary, is this idea of physical force. But if somebody is exploited, for instance, in your example, where they only have the choice of working for a low wage or being homeless, there's not a physical force involved in that, but there is a force of coercion. There's a force that is involved in restricting the options for life. Now, if somebody were to come to me and say, well, hey man, that's not violence because nobody's picking up a stick and beating people with it, I would say, yeah, there's no picking up of sticks and beating people with them. But there is still coercion. So how about we move beyond obsessing over the definition of this word and talk about the actual processes and outcomes, and then talk to ourselves about, are we okay with that or are we not? And I often find that this is the approach I have for words that have contested definitions, and particularly for words where definitions are contested because different people come to the conversation with their own narrative framings that they wish to impose. The definition of fascism is a perfect example. So earlier this year, and in fact, you and I now have had several recordings talking about the quote unquote F word. And you began this podcast by referencing a recent recording where, as you say, you mentioned the 13 different definitions of fascism. I made a TikTok video and I said something along the lines of, quote, gentle reminder that indigenous peoples in the so-called Americas have been experiencing fascism for the last 500 years. Now you can imagine the dictionary bros that came into the conversation. And reflecting on that, reflecting on my use of that word and how people engage with it, I'm almost at the point of saying, forget the word. Because clearly the word itself brings certain images to your mind. Forget about the word and look at what was happening. Look at the forces at play, which, by the way, are historical. European colonizers wrote about the forces they imposed on indigenous peoples. They wrote about race and the invention of race as a method of control. They wrote about the trading and the weapons and the what we would now call ethnic cleansing and so on and so forth. Do you feel like that's cool, bro? Or do you have something to say about it that says, no, actually, I don't think that was okay? So I just like to pause there because, as you can see, there are many words swirling around, and the words themselves have their own narrative power. And because of that, they are subject to social power dynamics.
Mm.
And I would be curious to hear your response to that in terms of, do certain words bring clarity to conversations, or do they bring confusion? And the last thing I would add is, when I think about conversations, I'm seeing more and more that it is, of course, audience dependent. I may use a piece of jargon in a community of friends or a community of practitioners where we all agree with what the word means, and so it doesn't have to discuss it. And indeed, jargon in my world is a piece of language that's used to speed conversation.
Mm.
But if I were to take that same piece of jargon and use it with a generic audience, like on LinkedIn or on TikTok or something like that, I would expect to bring in many different audiences with many different pictures of what the definition is. And perhaps that just leads to confusion. So I also wonder, to what degree we have to be selective about the audience in which we use certain words so that we can actually have a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you're using the word fascism in that kind of mixed audience, like you say, it slows the conversation down. It gets derailed. It creates distraction for people. And so, does violence work? Normally, people think of that in terms of like a response, like an activist response. But I'm not going there, and I'm not talking, and I'm not judging. I'm saying, does it work? And so, is the mass killing of Palestinians and through starvation and bombs, is it working? And then that forces you to think, well, what would work look like? What does it mean that it's working? For whom? Um, is the 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 limited options of ways to feed yourself in the United States, is limiting those options, is that working? Is limiting options for getting shelter working? Is is the impunity of police officers working? All of those questions. So that's what the question is. Like, is this kind of force, be it physical or not, are these injuries working? Like, is it working? And you can call it violence or not, but I think of course, we live in an age where we want a catchy title. Does violence work? But it's not only that. It's not only to try to get people's attention. It's because the narrative around violence and the narrative around pacifism and nonviolence is where I want to go maybe next time with the conversation. But for this conversation, it's not judgmental. I'm not getting us to say, is it right or wrong? I mean, you and I have our opinions about that, and everyone listening knows our opinions on whether these things are right or wrong. But I'm asking, is it working? And so, yeah, like, does emotional abuse work? Does verbal abuse work? Does physical force work? And the examples I've given have been state led. And when the state, like, what is emotional abuse of the state? It can mean, that people feel disempowered. They feel unable to have agency in their lives? You know, does 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 promoting that sense of disempowerment and despair, does it work? And I'm not talking about in personal relations. I'm saying with the state. When the state does it, are they reaching their goals in doing that? And so, yeah. So I think the implications of whether or not violence or force abuse works is for another conversation. But that's where I want people to go away from hearing our conversation to rethink where they see violence happening and if it works.
And I think what I want to surface, and it will naturally leave this conversation open-ended, which I think is what we wish for today. When we talk about whether something works, there is a certain binary within that, this idea of working or not working. And I often talk about encouraging ourselves to think beyond binaries. But there's a certain act of categorizing, that is to say, categorizing the world into binaries, that I think is what this question is about. And I'm not putting this as eloquently as I would like, but here's an example. As you were speaking, I thought about Israel's battle in Lebanon against Hezbollah in the year 2006. There are certain media outlets who have talked about how Israel lost that war. And there are other media outlets, particularly in the so-called West, that have talked about how Israel and Hezbollah fought to a, quote, stalemate in that war. And it made me think to myself that there is a distinction between stated goals, in this case of a state entity, and actual goals. Now, I want to go two places with this. The first place, though, that I'll go is I thought to myself in hearing about that a state has the power, of course, to change its stated goals anytime it wants, especially if it wants to make itself look better. And the two most recent examples of this are, of course, the genocide in Gaza, where early on the state of Israel said it wanted complete elimination of Hamas. And remember, Hamas is not just a resistance force, it is a political entity. Within that political entity is a militarized entity, the Al-Qassam Brigades. And so when we talk about elimination of Hamas, they were talking about an entire civil society entity, not just a military force. Now, 2 years on, the goals keep changing. And when I say goals, I'm talking about stated goals, goals stated by Netanyahu himself, where, and I wish I had LexisNexis in front of me so I could pull up all the different articles, but I was seeing a podcast just the other day where there are different actors within the Israeli government saying, hey, we've achieved our goals in Gaza, or now we're going to go to the West Bank, or now we're going to look at Lebanon, or no, we're not going to eliminate Hamas, but we're going to severely weaken them. And another perfect example of this is the war, the so-called 12-day war between Israel and Iran, where the first stated goal was complete elimination of Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missile program. Well, from that perspective, that looks like that violence did not work because Intel has said that the nuclear program may be set back only by a couple of months. And of course, the ballistic missile program is still very much in place in Iran. And there was a ballistic missile that hit within Israel only a few minutes before the official so-called ceasefire began at the end of that 12-day war. So from that perspective, the violence did not work. But within the middle of the war, the Israeli state began to change its goals, such that it could say at the end of it that it did work. And so as I'm leaving this conversation today, which I think is actually growing and broadening and becoming more complex in scope as we talk about it, I think what I'd like to leave the audience with is when we talk about violence working or not working, I think it's useful to ask ourselves, who gets to set those definitions of working or not working? Not just the definition of violence, but also of success and failure. And who gets to change those definitions, to change those metrics of success whenever they wish to, in order to make themselves look a certain way? I think that's an important nuance that bears raising in this conversation. And indeed, still, I'm only talking about state power in this case. That is to say, the expression of a state literally in terms of the words it's using with certain audiences. And so there's a very rich conversation to be held here. But that's what I'm leaving with, this idea that all of these words are subject to their own power dynamics, social power dynamics. And that's what I'm hoping our audience will leave with as well, to really think about who gets to control the narrative when we talk about these terms.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and just for me, it's just important that people think about where violence is coming from the majority of the time. that because as I said, usually we have this question, does violence work in the context of activism? But first, I want us to notice where the real, like everyday, biggest source of violence is. And does it work? Good to be with you, Chris.
Good to be with you, Heather. Thank you for this conversation, which each of our recordings brings me more to sit with and think about each time we discuss these different ranges of topics, all of which are very relevant to the present moment. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. See you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye. You have been listening to Morning Tinto with Heather Luna and Chris Musay-Sequeira. Each time we record, we use the news of the day to be as freshly brewed as possible. So subscribe, follow along, and comment if you can. Let us know what you think, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.